So it's a brand new year as always, and we get to talk about the next generation of iPhones this year, but we have to rewind back before we get too far ahead of ourselves, and we get to talk about the iPhone 8 Plus and how this device holds up in 2022. Now, this was one of the last iPhones to have that home button on the front. The iPhone SE2 obviously is that iPhone right now, but for several years, this was the last one, and we thought we were ahead of ourselves. We thought we were, past home buttons, but that wasn't the case last year in 2020. But now with the iPhone 8 Plus, it sits in a very interesting spot because it's still supported with software, but that iPhone 10 has gone down in value so much that it just kind of makes sense for me to recommend the iPhone 10 more than the 8 Plus, even though they share the same internals, and that's mostly due to the gesture-based design. The whole entire ecosystem with gestures and everything is so much better than the home button design, and I would recommend going up there if you want to, but if you currently own an iPhone 8 Plus, I would recommend keeping it. This is still a very solid phone, has so much capability, it's beautiful, it still feels extremely premium, and this device is still an extremely good device for sure when you consider the value per dollar. Now, I will leave some phones like the iPhone 8 Plus that I would recommend this year in the description below. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, with the body of the iPhone 8 Plus, it still feels and looks so beautiful. You have that 5.5-inch IPS panel on the front, and it is a very good looking panel. From the last year and the years before, when I've been comparing the iPhone 8 Plus to all its successors, I've been noticing that this panel is still very good. It's not an OLED, but it's still pretty decent. You have the fingerprint sensor on the front, quite a bit of bezel on the top and bottom, but it's really not that big of a deal. And after using this phone for a couple hours, you'll probably get used to it anyway. You have the lightning port at the bottom, and on the back, you have that glass back on this iPhone, which back in 2017, the only other iPhones that had full glass backs were probably the iPhone 4S. We had a little glass on the iPhone SE and iPhone 5S, but for the full glass back, this was pretty much the return of that, which was really, really nice. This device also brought wireless charging, it has IP certification, and it just feels so good in the hand that if you're comparing this build quality even against the iPhone 13s, this device still feels almost identical to those ones. So this is a huge asset for these devices for sure. Now, we also have to talk about the camera setup on this iPhone as well. So this thing had a dual camera setup on the back. We had a 12 megapixel wide angle lens, then a 12 megapixel telephoto lens, but we also had a 7 megapixel front facing camera. Now, this was the first iPhone to bring 4K at 60 on the back lens, and that was a really cool thing. Even now to this day, 4K at 60, if the iPhone doesn't have it, that's a very outdated phone, to be honest. Like the 7 Plus, I just reviewed it, that's kind of outdated now because of the lack of 4K at 60. However, on the front, we can only do 1080p at 30, which I think is still more than enough, for the most part, but it would have been nice to have 1080p at 60 at the very least, but 30 is perfectly fine. Now, this camera, I think, from my opinion, it's still a pretty decent camera overall. Now, it's not perfect, it's not breaking any records, but for the most part, if you needed a camera lens and you just do basic things like I do, like making Snapchat stories and going on Instagram and posting a story here and there, if you can edit up your photo a little bit, even better, but if not, the photos this thing takes is still pretty good. Yes, it's a little grainy, and the things that really distract me the most are the lack of extra sensors. This thing doesn't have an ultra-wide sensor, which is one of my favorite lenses for sure, but on top of that, things like no cinematic mode, no pro options like the newer iPhones have, and no 4K at 60 at the front are kind of things that kind of sway me away from this phone, but this quality is still pretty decent, and like I mentioned, if you can edit your videos a little bit or edit your photos a little bit, you'll be in a really good situation. But this thing still has 4K at 60 on the back, still has a telephoto lens, and still has portrait mode. That this is still a pretty decent lens for sure, and I'm pretty much a fan of it without a doubt. So in terms of the camera, that pretty much covers it up there. But another big thing about this phone is the software. This device got iOS 15 a couple of months ago, and I've been running the betas on this thing for a very long amount of time. I've been also talking about the official software updates as well, and this phone is still going to be getting software support for quite a bit of time, and that is a big thing to keep in mind. I think for the next 2 years this phone is set, so it's going to be lasting for the rest of this year, and then quite potentially getting iOS 17 next year as well. So this phone may not even end support until 2024, and that is at least 2 years from now in 2022. So without a doubt, I will tell you that this phone's software is perfectly fine. If you want to get a phone today that's going to last for the next couple of years, then this is definitely a decent phone. However, if you want to get a phone today that's going to last for many more years, you may want to look at something like an iPhone 11 or an iPhone 12, which the iPhone 11 may be a better choice. So those are kind of things to keep in mind. But with this device, I still think it's completely good in terms of software, and I don't really think it's that big of a deal right now. So in terms of software, that covers it up there. Now moving on to the performance side of things, this device has that Apple A11 Bionic chip inside of it with 3 gigs of RAM. Now here's the thing that I'll tell you about this specific phone. this performance is still pretty decent. The only thing, and if I'm being honest, the only thing that kind of even ages this phone a little bit is that home button. Anytime you have to consistently click that home button and then it gets kind of, like weird here and there, it does kind of get a little weird, and I'm not really a huge fan of it for sure. But once the applications are loaded and everything is fine, it's a pretty good experience. Like, I don't really have too many issues with it right there. I do wish this thing was a little bit better in terms of the smoothness aspect. iOS is still extremely smooth, but there are some jitters here and there. And when I was comparing this iPhone against my iPhone 13, the biggest thing that I noticed is beyond just the wait times of waiting for an app to open on this is the opening and closing of applications and scrolling through the UI. Simple things like that. That's kind of where it's starting to show its age. But other than that, as long as the apps are loading and everything, I'm perfectly fine. And you're not comparing an iPhone 8 Plus to the 13 every day, so you're really not going to notice too many issues there either. So in my opinion, the performance of this phone is more of an asset than a con. I actually do think it's a pretty decent performing phone for sure. So in terms of performance, that pretty much covers it up there. Now, ending it off with the battery life, this device has that 2,691 mAh battery. And the battery life was never the best feature of this iPhone. It was better than the iPhone 8, but it was kind of a downgrade from the previous generation. And even now in iOS 15, it has gone down. It's definitely not perfect, but I do think since this is a 5-year-old phone now, quite potentially people understand that this phone isn't supposed to be the best performing phone of all time. And I think people are understanding of the battery life on this phone is definitely not amazing, is definitely not, great. I would say it's expected for what you were getting. I would put it in line with something like an iPhone 12 mini, quite potentially even worse than an iPhone 12 mini, to be honest. Even though it's a bigger size, it isn't really that much better battery life, and that's kind of a disadvantage. And iOS 15 has kind of taken a toll on some of these phones with older chipsets. I do think by the end of iOS 15 it's going to stabilize, but that is another thing to keep in mind. So in terms of battery life, it's definitely not amazing, but if you're around a charger and if you're not complaining about your battery life all the time, then I think this may be a kind of decent battery life at the end of the day. So in terms of battery life, that covers it up there. And to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, I'm going to be honest, the iPhone 8 Plus is still a very decent phone in 2022. It's definitely not perfect. It still has a lot of capability. When you look at this phone, it still looks extremely beautiful. That beautiful panel on the front is still nice. Obviously, it has a lot of bezel and that fingerprint sensor is a little dated, but it's not that big of a deal. You still have a glass back. You still have a pretty decent dual camera setup on this thing too. And you can do 4K at 60. You can do a lot on this phone still. The performance is still pretty decent. And this phone is going to be lasting for a couple of more years without a doubt. If you have like a couple $100s to spend, let's say like $200 something, an iPhone 8 Plus is not a bad idea. But as always, if you want to future-proof yourself, getting something like an iPhone 11 or an iPhone 13 or whatever, an iPhone 12, that's always going to be the better choice. But from a value per dollar standpoint, this is not a bad choice. But I would also recommend if you're going to be in this price range, going up and spending maybe an extra $40, $50 on an iPhone 10 may be a better choice, but the iPhone 8 Plus is still a pretty decent iPhone for sure. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.